because of the fluctuating hormones of perimenopause and things, menopausal depression is also fluctuating. So a lot of women might feel quite okay some days, and then it's followed by these times of losing their nana and stuff, or those periods of teariness.
I'm Jo Clark, and thanks so much for joining me today. This is the Redefining Midlife podcast, a podcast designed for the 40-plus woman who is determined to challenge society's myths and beliefs around midlife. It's for the woman who is inspired and ready to define midlife her way. Join me each week as I chat to health and wellness experts for up-to-date information on how to live well as some special conversations with incredible everyday women redefining what midlife can look like. Here's to making our next half of life even better than the first. The physical symptoms of the menopause transition are many and varied, but it's the emotional roller coaster that comes as a huge surprise for many women, and it's a topic that's not spoken about enough. If you've ever had the thought, I don't feel myself anymore, or I think I'm going mad, I'm losing my mind, I'm always overwhelmed, but nothing's changed, or perhaps you just experience sudden feelings of anger, irritability, or rage, it can all be very disorienting, and I want to assure you that it's far more common than you perhaps realise, and you definitely aren't alone. This week, I welcome back Kirstin Bouse, a clinical and forensic psychologist who specialises in working with midlife women. I'm thrilled that we're going to be having Kirstin back from time to chat about some of the big emotional challenges that happen for women in this phase of life and how we can best navigate them. Now, Kirstin was last on the podcast back in episode 67 when the conversation centred around how to deal with the stresses that can come with the festive season. But today in our conversation, we're going to be chatting all about the mental health issues that can appear or worsen during midlife. As well as giving us some super helpful information, Kirstin also has some great resources that you can access. So just listen in for those and how you can get them. I hope our chat today helps you, and if it does, I'd love to hear from you. And if you know of another woman who would benefit from this episode, please be sure to share it with her. Welcome back to the podcast, Kirstin. It's great to have you here as our resident midlife psychologist.
Thank you for having me. It's so much fun. I love this chat.
We had a very large pre-chat beforehand, and there's lots to talk about. So in our last episode we had together, we talked about how to get through the madness and all the stresses of Christmas. Mm-hmm. But this time in our conversation, I want to focus on the mental health issues that increase for women who are in the middle of life.
Yeah.
And as we did touch on it in the last episode, just that the menopause transition comes at a time when there are just so many other major transitions happening for a woman. Whether you're dealing with adolescent children, or you're facing an empty nest, or you're dealing with aging parents, or you're dealing with the grief because your parents have passed, career shifts, relationship issues, it goes on and on and on. So we're just going to be talking about the menopause transition. And I'd love for you to come on, if you're willing to chat about some of these other big issues, because there's lots that I think women need to hear about, that it is normalised and they're not alone.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you don't get to midlife without collecting a bit of baggage along the way, some of which we might have addressed and some of which we might have just kind of turned a bit of our back to, and a future self to deal with. So we've got that we bring into this stage. And then, as you said, all those big life events that go on. Like it's such a marker of, this will sound so doom and gloom, and I don't feel like this, but in some ways it's really the beginning of the end. You know, once you hit a certain stage of midlife, it does seem that, and we were talking about this before, that, you know, kids are doing their thing, they're leaving home, and then adult parents, siblings, friends, we just start to see this real increase in a lot of events that can be joyful in terms of seeing our kids flourish and build their own lives. But also there can be a lot of grief and sadness. There is, it's unavoidable. And because of that, as I was saying before, like I get frustrated that the conversation around menopause does tend to ignore the fact that we bring our histories to menopause, and then we have all this other stuff that sadly we can't control that happens over, until really we're not around anymore as well. So many, many decades we've got ahead of us of big life events, many of which can be difficult.
Yeah, that's right. And we can't pretend that everything is wonderful all the time. To sweep things under the carpet is not going to help us at all, but to talk about things and being open and seeing what we can do to help ourselves get through things faster and easier is really is going to benefit us all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think kind of this is why it's so interesting that, at the same time, menopause decides to throw us this kind of experience as well, which is such an internal experience. And if we live long enough, we're going to go through it. And it's really, I have never used the word discombobulating so much as I have since I've been talking about menopause, because that's really what happens. And the many internal things on all the layers of our physiology, our neuroendocrine system obviously is what kickstarts it, our psychology, our cognitive functioning, all of these things are internal, but they have an external expression and experience of them as well. And therefore, they're also the things that interface with our other relationships and, things that are going on in our life. So yeah, it's a bit like, geez, thanks, just throw us in the deep end really here. But at the same time, and at risk of I guess some people perhaps hearing this as me not recognizing just how difficult this life stage can be, because I've lived it and I kind of have crawled my way out. So I do know. But I also feel as though it's a stage that menopause kickstarts this very big disruption in our lives. And perhaps it's a bit woo-woo, but I have a feeling it's designed to. I have a feeling that its role is to to shake us up so much that we really take stock of who we are, who we want to be, how we want to live our life for these next few decades, many decades, hopefully, that we've got. And I know that some people, I'm a psychologist, so I work with people at very different stages of this transition. So everything from those women who are really brought to their knees, their mental health is really, really suffering. And I put my hand up as someone who experienced that, right through to women who are tracking relatively well and are able to see this opportunity as an opportunity, not as just something that, is killing them, basically. And so there's this wide spectrum of experience. And, hopefully what I hope to do and my colleagues hope to do is help meet people wherever they're at and journey them further forward. And in an ideal world, it would be as far as that kind of flourishing perspective. But people do start from different places.
They do. And I certainly agree with you in that it's an opportunity for us to, we're given an opportunity to see life in a different way and the way to live in the next few decades. That's the positive way of looking at it. And in recognizing that it is not all doom and gloom. This isn't going to be a show on doom and gloom, but it's also recognizing that many, many women do experience mental health issues during this phase of life simply because of a number of the transitions happening at once, or perhaps it may be more hormonally based. So in preparing for our interview, I did find some what I thought were quite shocking statistics that I'm going to share with our audience right now just to set the scene. And ladies, I really want you to listen to these important numbers and research findings, because if it doesn't include you, maybe you're not that number, but maybe you have a friend, a relative, or colleague, someone that you know who may be one of these women who are suffering from a mental health disorder during this time of life. So depression is almost twice as common in women as in men. It's known that it lasts longer, is more severe and disabling for women than for men, and it usually gets worse if it's going to happen around menopause. There was a large study published in the British Medical Journal that found 1 in 3 perimenopausal women had severe psychological symptoms compared to 1 in 4 who had severe physical symptoms such as hot flushes. And that there was also women with no history of anxiety that they were twice as likely to develop anxiety in perimenopause and very early menopause as at any other time in their life, and are 2 to 4 times as likely to develop depression. There's a lot in that. There's a
heck of a lot in that. And, it was a long time. In fact, it was only really recently that we actually joined the dots. So women, the age range in which women commit suicide the most, so the age range where that happens the most often, is in the 45 to 55 age range.
Oh, wow.
And we've only really quite recently connected it to the perimenopause kind of stage. And, that's shocking that this is a stage where women, end their lives. And an amazing menopause GP in New Zealand, her name is Dr. Linda Deer, and she's kind of called, her name is Meno Doctor. She did a survey in 2022 in New Zealand, and then last year she did a survey on Australian women. And similarly, I might kind of just share some stats, because I think what's really cool is we haven't had Australian stats until kind of relatively recently. And so they're not really too different from what you shared. But I do want to kind of really hone in on this because it's a very, very real thing. So in this survey, and I think she had around 1,500 participants at various stages of the menopause kind of transition, 23% said that life was not worth living. 19% thought of ending their life, and the same 19%, or maybe not the same, but 19% also thought others would be better off without them. 88% said symptoms negatively impacted their relationship with their partner. 51% impacted negatively their relationship with their kids, and 87% said it negatively impacted their sex life. Working, the stats are also huge. 82% said that menopause impacted their work negatively in some way. And we've got what's called, 1 in 11 women in Australia have to quit their jobs because of the severity of their menopause symptoms. Now, these are huge stats. And I guess, when we talk about menopause, we've got physical symptoms, which a lot of us know. They're the hot flushes, they're the night sweats, they're the delightful weight gain that we're also happy to have. Body aches and pains. I mean, there's weird stuff too, like burning mouths and itchy ears, and everything's dry. Everything that's not supposed to be becomes dry.
We dry from the inside out is what I
offer. Pretty much. And, there's some of the well-known physical kind of symptoms. In terms of the cognitive symptoms, we have memory difficulties. We often talk about finding our words. I have a joke that I can complete a sentence as long as my friends are there to fill in the words that I can't find, and vice versa. Like, collectively, we can actually have a conversation. Word finding is a really big challenge of mine, which is frustrating.
Mine too.
Yeah, being good with words and quite articulate, and going into a room, forgetting what we were going into, all of that kind of stuff. And then there's the psychological kind of factors, which sleep can sit in a couple of camps. It can be physical, can be cognitive, it can be psychological. People look at it differently, but sleep is a massive, massive symptom. Fatigue, low mood, anxiety, depression, all of that kind of stuff. So, it has a really, really big impact on most of us. I think there's a bit of disputing, but about 75% of women will experience symptoms that have at least a moderate impact, negative impact on their life. And I think one of the shocks that I've had coming into this stage myself, and I'm kind of 8 years into perimenopause, is that it just keeps changing. So it's not like whatever your symptoms are in that first year are going to be what continues until you hit menopause. It just keeps morphing, and therefore we're constantly pivoting. And there is a neuroscience explanation for that, which we can kind of come up, talk about a bit later. But yeah, the impact's huge. And I guess if we go back to mental health, as you very rightly said, you know, it's not just about our hormones. There's all these other life events that are going on at the same time. So because of it is a neuroendocrine event, menopause is, and it actually creates both vulnerabilities and opportunities in terms of what's going on in our brain. And it's the vulnerability side that we're talking about when we're talking about mental health issues. So for women who've had mental health issues before, unfortunately, they are more vulnerable. They're more likely to actually experience a recurrence of the mental health issues during this period of time because of all the neurological changes that are happening. At the same time, it's not unusual for women to have first occurrences of depression and anxiety in this period of time as well. There is some, I guess, disagreement in the medical community as to whether is it menopause that creates that vulnerability, or is it the fact that at this stage of life is filled with some really difficult and stressful challenges, or is it the combination of? And you know, there's a bit of argy-bargy, unfortunately, in this area. And I think what we just need to take away from this is it's a challenging time, and it's a time where we need to be mindful of how we're tracking, and we also need to be mindful of the people we care about who are also going through this stage, because it is a tricky one. And unfortunately, not all our medical, and I also include my psychology colleagues, are across menopausal depression and anxiety, because it tends to look different than major depressive disorder and anxiety disorders at other times in women's lives.
So, Kirstin, can I just stop you there and say, from a professional point of view, then, if you had somebody walking through the door, say, for myself, if I walked through your door and I was exhibiting some sort of mental health or ill health, I should say, how would that look different then? How would it look different from another person coming in who might be 20 years younger or 20 years older than me, or a man? You know, what is the difference?
Yeah, so, well, first and foremost, I guess, interestingly, I would start tuning into this from someone's late 30s. So I certainly be just looking from 45 onwards anymore, because we know perimenopause can start at, you know, a far younger age than initially expected. But you know what? There's two key, particularly with menopausal depression, which, you know, another way to think about it is it's a hormonally driven depression, a bit like postnatal depression.
Okay.
And the picture that comes with those two types of depression, both of which are hormonally driven, is quite contrary to women and how they look depressed normally. And that is one thing, biggest thing, is the anger and the irritability. So typically women, when they're depressed at other stages of their life, tend to have the teary, flat, withdrawn, sad, melancholy kind of picture.
Yeah.
And that can still exist for sure, but it's often in these two stages of life, and also puberty, by the way, and that's a whole other conversation, but it's punctuated by that 0 to 1,000 rage that just takes over when, you know, Optus are frustrating you on the telephone.
Look out, there's a menopausal woman who's on the other line.
Yeah. Or your husband's snoring next to you and you can't sleep, you know, those moments.
But that's so true, because a lot of women that I've spoken to talk, like, I haven't experienced that rage, but they speak of it as meno rage.
Yeah. It's very unique because you know, on the other side of it, and it can come and go so quickly. So the other side of it could be like, you know, 5-10 minutes later, you know it is the rage is not warranted. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not something that warrants frustration or irritability or even anger, but that really intense rage that's quite a physical experience as well. On the other side of it, you actually know that it's just more intense. It's bigger than the situation warrants, which then also is, can kind of really add to how you experience it. So suddenly layering it with feelings of guilt and feelings of, thoughts of this isn't like me. I'm not normally someone to fly off the handle this way. You might say things that you really regret. And so that is very disorienting for women who just haven't had that level of anger, that level of rage before. It's something that there's a very funny family story about me running into the road after someone who filled my skip bin before I had finished filling it, screaming profanities from the middle of the road, which is not me at all. But the rage I felt was all-consuming, and I very quickly settled down and found it quite funny. Fortunately, no one was hurt, was injured, had no long-lasting consequences other than a really good story. But, it's so not like me. And that's often what I hear. So when women come into my room, probably there's a couple of things that are really common for me to hear. One is, I just do not feel like myself. I'm always overwhelmed, and I used to be able to handle stuff really easy, really well, and nothing's changed for me. Like, nothing's changed to explain why I'm overwhelmed all the time. I'm just suddenly not able to cope with what I used to cope with. So then there's the other statements. I think I'm going mad. I think I'm losing my mind. And that kind of links into both the mood-oriented stuff as well as the memory stuff. So a lot of women are really worried that their memory problems are early signs of dementia and Alzheimer's and things. That's very, very scary. But, again, and then if they've had prior mental health, like if they've had depression previously, and I'm going to put aside postnatal depression, but if they've had other periods of depression, they will typically say it feels different to how their other depressive. So there's the similarity of the teariness and stuff like that, and withdrawal, but the irritability and the rage is quite different. The other thing with menopausal depression that's really different, and I'm spending a lot of time trying to educate my profession in this space because it's super important, is that depression is typically, and in fact, in order to be able to diagnose major depressive disorder, there has to be this consistent picture of symptoms. But because of the fluctuating hormones of perimenopause and things, menopausal depression is also fluctuating. So a lot of women might feel quite okay some days, and then it's followed by these times of losing their nana and stuff, or those periods of teariness. And then again, they're having days where they feel relatively okay mood-wise. And that's very different. And so a professional who doesn't know about menopausal depression and how it looks would probably not diagnose depression because it doesn't fit this typical criteria around diagnosis of depression. Yes. So women sent off to, it's just busy, just go do some yoga. You just got too much on your plate, see what you can offload. That definitely doesn't address it. The other thing sometimes is they are given antidepressants. And what we know for hormonally driven depression, it is probably the one time where I would strongly advise they speak to a menopause specialist, because MHT in those instances are going to be more effective than your typical antidepressants.
Is it simply because if a woman was to go on hormonal therapy, it would just, rather than have the big highs and lows, the swings that happen in a cycle as they're going through perimenopause, it will even it out somewhat. So therefore those cycles will be lessened and they would experience it not quite as severely.
Yeah. And I mean, again, antidepressants as well can take a while to find what works, dose, type, bang. And the same can go for MHT, because there's obviously lots of different ways that types of MHT and ways you get it into your body and doses So unfortunately, neither are often a quick fix, but it is definitely about trying to, I guess, buffer the slow decline of estrogen and progesterone, testosterone and stuff, and make those peaks and troughs not quite so high and low.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Kirstin, is there any correlation between women who might suffer from PMS and the mood swings happening sometimes with those hormonal shifts? Are they more likely to suffer from mental health issues during perimenopause and early postmenopause?
I'm not aware of PMS, but I'm not sure if you've heard of PMDD. So
I have, yes. Okay, rightio. Yep.
So PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, is, I guess, it's a very magnified version of PMS, in the sense that in the period of time before a woman gets her period, those with PMDD have significant crashes in their mood, and I know plenty over the years where they would say, I go from feeling okay to I am suicidal, and some might even say homicidal, which is a bit tongue in cheek, but they're just so depressed and so enraged. And it's a terrible way to live because it's so cyclical, and they are at greater risk of these kinds of things. I don't know how much greater. I think, like most women's health, we're only just part of the conversation, part of research and things, but yeah, we definitely know that that is a vulnerability, just like trauma is a vulnerability that we take into it, and just like, as I said, other types of depression, whether it's major depressive disorder or whether it's postnatal depression, they do kind of make us a little bit more vulnerable to these things. Having said that, I don't want women to kind of think, oh, that's in my background and that's in my history, and suddenly become highly, highly alarmed, because that it's not a one-for-one, shall we say. It's definitely, everyone who's gone through this will definitely experience.
And that's the important part about having these sorts of conversations. It's not to become alarmist and say this is going to happen to you. It's just becoming aware, being informed. So you can, you might be more aware of yourself, or perhaps someone else who's close to you, and notice that there's something different and something going on where they're going to need help. Can you then talk about the relationship between menopause, depression, anxiety, in the fact that can one lead to the other? If I'm highly anxious, would that then lead to a depressive state? Or if I'm depressive in a depressive state, am I going to continually be in an anxious state also? This is for someone like myself who hasn't got a good grasp of these concepts.
Yeah, and I think, yes, that is the case, and it's also the case at any other time in our lives, and it can also for men as well. If you think about, particularly like if you think about being anxious all the time, and what we often do when we're anxious is we avoid the things that make us anxious, and I often talk about how that leads to our lives shrinking. And when our lives shrink, then there's often not much joy. We miss out on the things that bring us joy. We also might then not be able or as capable of doing the kind of adulting that we actually need to do, which then has a flow-on effect in lots of different ways. And so if you think about that kind of set of circumstances, if you're anxious for long enough and it's starting to mean that you're not engaged with friends and family, because it triggers your anxiety, and you find it really difficult to go to work. So you're having a lot of sick days, and then your boss is starting to kind of be, a bit on your back, or it's impacting you financially. Any of those things, for a period of time, you will start to get very down, because you aren't functioning and able to do the things that are meaningful and or important. Life for sure. So that can definitely be a common thing. In terms of depression to anxiety, that can happen as well. Again, it's about what's causing the depression. And so if you can kind of imagine that if women are feeling like their symptoms are unpredictable and difficult to manage, and then that getting them down, and in order to manage them, then they're also avoiding certain places and things, and they get anxious when they go to places. So, it's definitely those two things can go hand in hand. They don't always go hand in hand, but they can.
Okay. So if somebody notices that they are experiencing mood changes, they're not feeling like they're able to cope, as you said, there's some of the things that you don't feel like themselves, they're feeling overwhelmed, nothing's really changed in their lives, but they can't cope, or feeling like they're losing their mind. What sort of things could a woman do to start to, just small changes? Is there something that you would recommend, or a number of things that you would recommend for them to do?
Yeah, well, I think, sometimes we're so overwhelmed that this is just adding one more task, but it is a useful thing in the sense of, I think, keeping a bit of a track of symptoms, including your mood. And that is where, Louise Newsom's Balance app is really, really useful, because it tracks your mood and a whole bunch of your kind of symptoms, your sleep, your activity, all that. I'm hopeless at tracking stuff daily, absolutely hopeless. I'm not sufficiently disciplined, but I can manage to kind of maybe, track certain things a couple of times a week. And that's enough for me to be able to get a bit of a sense of a pattern. So I think that's really important. And the reason is because at times it can feel like, we're going crazy, it's all in our head, particularly if we have days where those symptoms aren't so pronounced. It's like, oh, it's just a bad day, I was really busy running around, someone at work, was difficult, whatever. We can find ways to excuse it. And it's just human nature for us not to be able to hold all this information and a pattern and see a pattern in our heads. So it's really useful to kind of try and track some of this stuff. In which case, if you're seeing, your anxiety is pretty consistent, and if your mood is pretty low, and when I say mood, I'm talking about, the tearfulness and or the rage both, then definitely, to be honest, I would actually be speaking to a doctor. I wouldn't, we had a conversation earlier that for me, MHT is an option. It's not for everyone for a variety of reasons. I don't think it's a cure-all for everyone, for every woman by any means, but I think getting in front of a GP, and ideally a menopause-informed GP, is really going to be helpful to get some perspective on what's happening for you. And being able to take that kind of data is also really useful. And, women may well initially opt to kind of, what can I do to support myself? And they may be able to make some lifestyle changes. And this is where things like perhaps they can engage with better sleep hygiene to help them sleep better, which we all love sleep. It can be a bit elusive for some of us, but, it's really important, and it's really important to our mental health as well. It just gives us a bigger bandwidth to cope with life.
Yeah.
And so it might well be that they've got the ability and the energy to be able to make lifestyle changes. Like, okay, I'm going to focus on my sleep, and I'm going to try and do some degree of movement, because we know that that's really helpful. And I'm going to try, I'm going to try and reduce my drinking. And people don't often want to hear that, but alcohol is not a good thing at this stage of life. And I'm going to see if I can add some things that really bring me joy, even if I don't feel like them all the time. And I'm not saying go overboard, because often our energy is quite low. So they might try that, or some of those or all of those. But the interesting thing is, what we need to also recognize is sometimes we're really asking people, or people are asking of themselves, to do things that take bandwidth, that take energy, and they don't have it, which is why for some women opting for the hormonal support is actually a first step, because it can start to reduce some of the symptoms. It can help improve some things, give them a bit more energy, and maybe even just a bit more optimism and hope. And then you can't outrun a crappy lifestyle. So then they may well have the bandwidth and the energy to be able to make some of the more meaningful changes in their life. So I'm always really mindful when I work with any women, but particularly women who are struggling with their mental health, I don't want to give them too much to do because they won't do it, because they can't do it. And then they just flog themselves because they can't do it. And that's not what I want to set up. I think we need to be really realistic, and we need to be very, very compassionate. And as people around them, whether it's personal or professional, we need to provide the compassion, because if there's one thing that I know women generally struggle with, it's self-compassion. And we can learn that over time. But again, when we're really, really low, we need the people around us to throw buckets of it on us until we're in a better position to kind of start having more and developing our, what I like to call our self-compassion muscle for ourselves. And I guess in addition to that, I'm very, very aware, and we probably don't have lots of time to talk about it, but I'm very aware that women's experience of perimenopause and menopause, postmenopause is very much determined by their personal circumstances and the social, cultural kind of circumstances that they're living in. I have met a number of women who have said to me, if I could just go part-time, I think I'd be okay, but I can't. I can't come into work later, even though I've slept terribly, and it'd be great if I could start work at 11, not at 9 or 8 or whatever, but I don't have that flexibility. I'm not allowed to work from home, or I just need to not have so many things on my plate. If somebody was home, as a single parent myself, if there was someone home to adult alongside me, so I'm cooking, they're running kids around, all of those things really, really have a big impact. And on the reverse, I've had women say to me, menopause would have been trickier if I had to still work in the job that I was working, or if my parents were still sick. My parents passed, quite early in my stage of perimenopause, which was awful and tragic and painful. But if I had to still care to them in the degree that I had been, I would be shattered. And so again, we have to really understand women's circumstances before we start throwing things at them that they should do. And I won't get on my patriarchy rant, I promise.
Oh, please do. Go on.
I will just say,
I'll give you a little opening.
that we are the carers in society, and it's so interesting that there's this huge push that we need to be responsible for making sure we're still okay enough to fulfill this social expectation of caring for others. Well, hang on a minute, it's a bit of a two-way street. Like, sure, we need to take responsibility for ourselves, but as I said, many women try to, and yet their circumstances just prevent them from, like, that would just be the icing on the cake if those circumstances gave them a little more flexibility at this stage of life. For many women, that's not possible.
No.
So yeah, it does quite frankly piss me off that the narrative is always on us to deal with what's going on, and the subtext is so that we can continue to be productive, because we can't be fertile anymore. We're not of any use in that regard. So our use comes from caring for others. And yeah, that's I could keep going.
I will back you up with it all too. It's a shifting sands, isn't it? The cultural, not the cultural, the constant shifting sands that women experience at this stage of life.
Yeah.
And some of that is because of the cultural expectations that we have as well.
Yeah.
That
absolutely.
we are expected to pick up on, oh, your parents are aging, so therefore it'll be the women who will pick up that and be the carers for that. Oh, the kids are getting older, well, therefore it's us having to take, well, not us as in you and I, but as a group of women as a whole. That seems to be what's happening. All the while, there are big changes and shifts happening to them that they have very little control over.
Yeah, exactly. So in a perfect world, we would do what we could personally. And as I said, we all need to take as much responsibility for our health as we can, but would be supported by our family and our broader social circumstances to do it as well. Yeah.
Interesting as well, that happens when you look into this stage of life and how it can be different in different cultures, and how women from different cultures may experience it slightly differently. What have you found in your own experience as a psychologist? Have you noticed that with some of the different women who come to see you?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think when you've been raised and or living in, a white Western culture, the things that women are valued for is their fertility, is their beauty, is their youth, all of that, because they're all kind of wrapped up together. And so aging isn't something that, I mean, you just have to look at, social media and marketing and all the rest, all the messages that we get. Anti-aging, it's hard to find women in midlife, let alone beyond, represented in clothing kind of stores and stuff like that. Interestingly, I was looking for a paint by numbers, supposedly for my downtime, and I really wanted to find a midlife looking woman to paint, and I could not find one. I could find young women, or I could find really, really like elderly, kind of cute, holding hands with an elderly, husband or whatever. Could not find any image, and I scoured a lot of sites to represent a midlife woman. And I think that's just one example, and it's everywhere. So I think for us, there's lots of commentary around feeling invisible, feeling as though we're not valued anymore, because that is the messaging that we receive. And I think, we're this generation, all of us who are here right now, are trying to make changes in that regard, because we completely disagree with it. We know that it's wrong. In other cultures, particularly more Indigenous cultures, aging is something, you're revered the older that you get. You're valued, you're considered so wise. And it's also seen as a real privilege, like it's recognized that to be able to age and become old and elderly is a gift. And in that, the gift you give your community is your wisdom. And so it is interesting that some of the research, quite a bit actually, really does show that the symptoms that are typically reported for perimenopause for women in, white Western cultures are not reported anywhere near to the same degree. And I don't want anyone to kind of take away from that this concept of it's all in her head, because we've had enough bullshit, medical misogyny and stuff. That's definitely not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is we have these very real experiences internally that are exacerbated by the cultural narrative and the social narrative. And it makes it all the harder. And I think the biggest thing, for me, even personally, was, the work that I used to do required such a level of sharpness and the ability to distill and integrate vast quantities of different information from different sources. I did a lot of court expert work. And then if I'm on court, doing a lot of mental gymnastics, on the fly. And funnily enough, I can still do that because I went to court only recently, but the cogs just turn far more slowly. I'm just nowhere near as efficient. And yet there is this depth of experience that I possess, but trying to get it out of my head, it's really challenging. And that's been really challenging for me to come to terms with, because it's been part of my identity to see myself as a relatively sharp, a person who likes using her brain in quite a complex way, and to come to terms with that not being something that I'm good at right now. It might come back. That would, all the research suggests that it does. It's been challenging for me in my identity and how I feel about myself. And then it's had a practical implication of me just realizing I can't do that work efficiently enough for it to be financially viable for me anymore to do that. Which, to be honest, is kind of a relief, because I've definitely felt a natural shift in my life purpose anyway. So it's kind of like, oh yeah, I want to change. I want to do something different. It's like, yeah, I can't do that old stuff anymore. But these things challenge us. They definitely challenge us, and that's what we're up against in this Western, particularly white culture.
Yes.
Is that challenge of who am I? Where's my value? Who am I now? It's hard.
It is hard.
Very hard.
And perhaps because there's less family or community support around us as well, and those structures around us, whereas perhaps some other cultures have that in place far more than what we do. That would have to make a significant difference, I could imagine, just knowing that there was somebody else there or groups of people who are there to give you a hand during these harder times.
So the other thing that's happening, and I'll just mention in case any of your community it applies to, but because women have had children later in life, in perimenopause and they've got little people, I cannot imagine looking after little people at this stage of my life. But there's many women who are. And the flow-on effect of that is also often their parents are really elderly and unable to play a role that they might have had the children come earlier. I know I've got some gaps between my kids and things, and my parents have been very involved in all of them, but a little less so, like noticeably so. And certainly if I had young children now, which some women do at 50, have primary school children, they just wouldn't be able to help the way that I was very lucky to have them help when my kids were at ages. And so I think that's another factor. So yeah, we don't have the village, but even if the village kind of in theory was possible in terms of that willingness there, sometimes the capacity of the family in the village is reduced because of aging populations and having children later.
Yeah. And it's interesting. We will talk a little bit more about the incredible research that's happening now, because for so many years women were seen as little men. So therefore, what happened to a man was going to happen to a woman, and how a woman's brain functions. But it's fascinating to hear, and I'd love to hear your perspective on this as well. Some of the research coming out, in particular by Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who's got a book out now, talking about how a woman's brain actually changes during and after menopause. And she mentions up to 6 years after menopause, it can take that amount of time. And because of her findings, she's challenging, and you mentioned it earlier before, challenging those outdated perspectives on menopause and emphasising its neurological significance. And she's talking more about recognising it as more of a neuroendocrine transition, because there are an increased risk of number of brain conditions. And she said, well, we've mentioned depression. She's also mentioned that women are 3 times at a higher risk of developing an autoimmune disorder, including those that attack the brain, like multiple sclerosis. We're 4 times more likely to suffer from headaches and migraines during this time of life, more likely to die of stroke, more likely to develop from some kind of brain tumours after menopause, and much higher risk of developing Alzheimer's disease than men do. So for you who are working with women's mental health, brains, this must be such exciting research coming out now, because all of a sudden what you've seen coming through your doors for years is being validated by research.
It is truly exciting. And, you know, in some ways it's not new. And let me explain that, because, you know, I've been a psych for 28 years now. We did not have MRIs or any of the kind of imaging and technology to see what's going on in the brain when I started. So we just knew stuff because we saw enough people and we thought this is, you know, kind of a real thing. And my head, when I'm kind of talking about this, thinks of trauma. So we would work with traumatized people, and you'd see certain kind of things and you'd think, yep, okay. And you'd talk about it from a clinical perspective, like it's my clinical experience that. And sure, research was done, but research was done based on people's self-report of symptoms, or perhaps family members' report of them and things. And then we got this kind of amazing technology and capability to dive in, and we really got to see what happens in the brain when there's trauma, when people have experienced trauma and stuff. And it feels really similar now. And so I often say to my early career psychs, like, you guys have no idea how lucky you are, because coming in at this stage where they've got what I would like to affectionately call kind of hard science to back up what we've known for a long, long time. And it is really, really exciting. And I guess I mean, I am a bit of a health nerd. Like I collect health information. I love it. I'm still not a doctor, so there's a level of detail and the medical language that I just don't have a foundation in. So there's a point where it's like, oh, that's over my head. But nonetheless, I really do draw on, like, I love medical people who translate it into language that I can understand, and I just swell up. And in addition to Dr. Lisa Mosconi, there's another woman who wrote a book quite a few years ago called The Upgrade, and her name's Dr. Dr. Luann Bresidine, and she's a psychiatrist. And she's been saying the same thing sorry if you heard that notification, but she's been saying the same thing for a while, in that there's this very kind of tumultuous stage that we go through, but that ultimately it's like, I know Lisa talks about renovating and things. Our house is in absolute disarray because there's walls coming down and going up, and everything's being shifted, and probably even the plumbing's being changed, the whole shebang. It's just messy. And it's almost like there's no sense, no order to it at all. And then slowly it comes together and it ends up being this far more beautiful house than what you started with. And both Luann and Lisa are essentially saying that. And what's really, really interesting is if you kind of dig deeper and look at women's lifespan, females' lifespan in general, we know that this happens in adolescence, and we've known this as long as we've been able to look at brains. We've known this. So it happens in puberty, it happens in pregnancy and postpartum. That's called matrescence. And then it happens in perimenopause, where everything just goes a bit nuts. But eventually we actually end up with a more sophisticated kind of brain that functions, at a higher level than before. It's this progressive, maturation process, neurological maturation process. Super cool. What also I like to share with women, though, is we actually go through this change every cycle. So since we've hit puberty, every 4 weeks, there's 4 stages to a cycle. And even if your cycle changes in length and stuff, there tends to be this predictable pattern of these hormones, at these kind of levels in this part of your cycle. And then the next, part of your cycle looks like this, and then the next and the next. So there's this predictable order of things. And our brain has been adjusting and adapting to all of those every month for as long as we've been menstruating. So we do have some experience with our brain's capacity to adapt and adjust and pivot, because we've been doing it since you got your period, which is super cool. And for me personally, I found that really, really reassuring, because it's kind of like I've got the skill set. It goes a bit haywire in these significant stages because our brains really just can't keep up with what's going on, and the order isn't the same. So the hormones are fluctuating in a pattern, not even really in a pattern. And so our brain's like, doesn't know whether it's Arthur or Martha, really. But eventually it starts to get a pattern to it, and then there's that overall kind of somewhat steadiness. I use that loosely, but certainly steadier than we've been for a long time. And that's when, there's that experience after a while of our brain can finally catch up. It can compensate for the things that it needs to compensate for. It can build neural pathways. And it's really super cool. And I think that's really reassuring. And it explains why a lot of the research you'll hear postmenopausal women, quite postmenopausal women, will say these are the best years of my life. And I think it's a bit like having a baby. You have a baby and you forget just how awful labour was.
Yes. Yeah.
And they have a sense that it was tough, but they're far more focused on how good it is now. And yet when you ask perimenopausal women, that's when you'll get it's a shit show, to be blunt. So yeah, it's kind of exciting. All this.
It is. I had on a guest expert, Dr. Sarah Mackay, who's she's a neuroscientist and wrote the Women's Brain book. So she was on explaining some of these changes as well. This is quite a number of episodes ago now. But you just go, well, this is, I suppose, for professionals like yourself, for other doctors or professionals who work in this with women in this stage of life. They've now got the evidence to back it up. So for the naysayers who you might, in your profession, who might be treating everyone the same and not realising there's a massive difference, at least now there's hard clinical data research to show that there's a difference. And for women who they're not just, it's not just, you know, something that they're thinking, oh, it's just all in my head, you know, I'm just making it up, there's something wrong with me. There's changes that are happening and we're all going to be experiencing it slightly differently.
Definitely. And I think that just creates such a different context, you know, for us to be navigating this period of time in. Like, if this is really normal, yes, it's difficult, but it's normal. I'm not abnormal. For most of us, there will come a time, many years postmenopausal, where we will be able to say, wow, life's good.
Yeah.
I've got my brain back and I'm feeling good. Which is really encouraging.
Good. Yeah. And I think together as a community, we can all help other women who are in there. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's hard.
That's the beauty of women, isn't it? I think we're so geared to, I guess, support each other. It's just how we're built, and there's so much beauty and wonderfulness, great word, I know, but in having friendships and relationships and connections with women that are older than us and younger than us, because we get that much broader perspective, which can be helpful when we're in the eye of the storm.
That's right. Kirstin, what sort of, we did talk about this prior to hitting record. You did mention some resources. So what sort of resources have you got that are available for women who might be struggling or finding things a bit difficult at the moment? Is there somewhere that you can direct them?
Yeah, so the allabouthercentre.com.au is our website. We only really recently launched this new business because it's separate to the group practice I've had for 18 years. Just recently launched, got practitioners that are involved and available to provide services, and we're still growing, which is super cool. There's things like both a perimenopause and a menopause symptom checklist. They're all based within solid research. There's some differences in terms of how many symptoms there are. Generally, it's about 34 agreed upon symptoms. So we've got those. I've got a journal prompt as well. So for women who are at a stage where they feel able to be reflective, they're not drowning perhaps anymore, there's some really great journal prompts that they can use to kind of really start to, I guess, make the most of this transition in terms of personal growth and development. I recorded a webinar, which was a little bit of a version of a speaking thing I spoke at, a presentation I gave at a women's event called The Magic and Madness of Menopause, and that's available for free. So that's a download. We also have a lot of fact sheets as well, and all the fact sheets are absolutely grounded in evidence-based research and things like that. So on a range of topics, there's lots of different bits and pieces that people can access on that particular site. And we're just going to continue to grow that as well.
Excellent. Well, I'll make sure that website is in the show notes as well, so people can go there straight away. So, Kirstin, thank you so much for our conversation today. I'm hoping it's helped somebody who might be finding themselves in a little bit of, negative downward spiral, or know of someone who has. So make sure, ladies, if you do know of somebody, or it's you yourself who is experiencing these issues, seek help. Share this episode, and let's all help each other through this stage of life.
And this is where All About Her Centre, we do have psychologists on the website, naturopaths, nutritionists. We'll be building the allied health kind of service providers. So there's ways to get support. But if people also want to start with a GP and they know their GP is not across this, I'm happy for them to email me through the website and ask who I might suggest and things. And I'm happy to do that as well. So,
that's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
We'll speak next time.
Yes, shall do.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening and sharing your time with me today. I'd love you to hit subscribe on Apple Podcast or your favourite podcast app to keep spreading these empowering messages. Please share this podcast with other incredible midlife women in your world. Join me again next week for another redefining midlife conversation. Thanks again for tuning in.